Cool. All right. Welcome everybody to another webinar. I'm Dr. Flick. We're going to be talking about exploring different medical specialties. We're going to talk in general terms about, what it takes for each specialty and some ideas on how to consider them. So kind of what it takes for each one. Let me introduce our guests here. So I'll introduce myself first real quick. So I'm David. I'm the director of the residency advising division at Med School Coach. I'm also the associate director of our pre-medical advising. In my civilian life, I am a family physician in a rural setting, and then I also still work in the Army Reserves as a flight surgeon and family physician. And I'm joined today by Justin Nabity. If you'll introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, it's great to be here with you. Thanks for the invitation to be able to team up with you on this. I'm the founder and CEO of Physicians Thrive, and our group is all about making sure that physicians know exactly what they should be making, how to protect it, and how to make it last. And very interested in this topic because as you think about what path you're going to go down and the implications of that from a financial perspective, there's some pros and cons to consider. And so I'll be kind of sharing some feedback along the way as Dr. Flick comments on different paths that you can take.
Yeah, fantastic. A quick note to everybody that's joining us is that this is a pre-recorded session just to make sure that we iron out everything and make it look good. And then we'll be available for questions during the actual screening of this. So feel free to just type in questions in the chat feature, and then we'll get to all your questions at the end. So I'm going to keep this as a little bit more informal because a lot of this can be a little bit PowerPoint heavy. So Justin, feel free to weigh in at any time, and let's have a conversation because this is pretty cool to be able to not only talk about how to select a medical specialty, but I don't know, it can be a little bit taboo in medicine to talk about finances and things like that, but it's a great thing to kind of discuss and learn about early on. So let's talk about what we're going to talk about, and then we'll get to it, okay? So we're going to start with broad themes about how to choose specialties. I'm not going to tell you, what specialty you should choose, but I want to kind of give you some ideas of questions to ask yourself and some tools to help you make a good informed decision. We're going to understand the competition, whether you're going into something competitive like dermatology, we're going to use as an example, versus something like pediatrics and primary care. We'll talk about the training that's involved in various specialties. And then what I really want to kind of spend some time on today is talking about things like accounts, the salary, the finances, how to make those decisions, and even identifying goals for you in terms of money. So let's jump into the first part of things where we're just going to touch some broad scope topics on what to consider in terms of choosing a specialty. So let's talk about work-life balance, okay? And a lot of people in medicine will say this doesn't exist, or even in medical school, it can feel like there is no such thing as balancing work and life. But here's some ideas to consider, and notice in my PowerPoint balance here, everything is nice and equal. That may not be the way you find it, but think of it more of as a flow, right? Is that work and life are going to go back and forth. But here's some things to at least, think about when it comes to how to make that balance. In your clinical work, there's going to be things like administrative stuff, right? Running the clinic, paperwork, insurance, charting, all that stuff. That's compared to your patient time, which is why you went into medicine in the first place, is to take care of patients. That may or may not be the bulk of what you do every day, and finding a balance in terms of those two things, even in work-life balance, is its own challenge. You've also got your academic interests. So, whether in an ultra specialized field like neurosurgery or something like family medicine like myself, there's still going to be academic interests in terms of maybe teaching, whether it's residents or medical students, shadowing for pre-meds, or even kind of journal articles or presentations and publications. So that's work side. And then on the other side of things is, all the stuff that hopefully you enjoy to do, whether it's hobbies, friends and family, or any other interests that you have. So when determining what you want to go into, especially as a medical student, or even when you're thinking even, if there's pre-meds listening in, is these are things to start thinking about early on, and that making sure that you have a good understanding about what is important to you and how you want those things to balance. Do keep in mind that life changes, right? I mean, in the interim, like pre-med, medical school, residency, life changes. Your hobbies may change. Your friends are going to change. Family hopefully staying the same, but you may get married or other things that can change. So before I skip on, any thoughts about work-life balance here, Justin?
Yeah, one of the things I would mention is that it's come up a lot we'll have clients that will join a practice and then they'll be there for a period of time and they'll find out quickly that there's all these additional responsibilities that they'll want you to take on, like serving on committees and different things. And so when you think about the type of practice that you join, you got to take into account that it may start with this being your level of commitment, but then that can evolve and it can expand over time. And so you want to be careful to think about how it might be a full-time position plus additional things that tack on depending on the track that you go down. And so sometimes that can kind of catch you off guard a little bit. So you really want to get a sense of what it's been like for the other physicians that are there. And so the more you can start to get to know them and get a sense of what their experience has been, you'll find out if there's anything like that could be kind of compounding and building up on expectations for responsibilities.
Yeah, and that kind of plays into almost protecting yourself as an employee, or even if it's private practice, is that it's going to be this slow creep of additional things, whether you sign a contract that says it or not. Every so often maybe somebody's going to come to you like, hey David, you want to do this or you want to do that? And sometimes it can be very hard to say no. Having an advocate maybe in your corner to say, hey, listen, when you took this job, here were your goals, let's make sure you stick with those goals. That's pretty important too. Yeah. Cool. So I love this slide because this was like the bane of my existence when I was a medical student, is that the pager becomes like, part of your body when you're in medical school, certainly on like surgical subspecialty rotations and things like that. Some people like this thing, believe it or not. There's something attached to your hip, and it basically is your lifeline to the hospital. And it represents, this is my idea of asking, do you want to be on call or not? If you're going to be a surgeon, you're probably going to have call. That means wearing a pager, keeping it with you at all times. And whether it's, you're rounding on a patient in the hospital, you may get paged for an emergency, consult in the emergency room, or maybe you're at your kid's birthday on the weekend. Hey, that pager is still part of you, maybe not every single day. The other thing to consider here too is that, not every specialty is required to take call, even if it's somewhat kind of commonplace in general for that specialty. So maybe a family medicine doctor like myself, who I don't take call, and I haven't seen a pager since I was a resident, which is glorious for me. Some family medicine doctors do take call. And maybe in a busy practice, a general surgeon may not take call certain periods of time if they kind of rotate that schedule through themselves. So this is my way of saying, ask yourself, do you like the idea of emergencies and being called in at any time? That can be exciting for some people, or it can be a real drag.
Yeah, and then I think on the contract side of things, when you do launch into that position, it's also important to take into account, are you going to be like the freshman coming into the practice and being responsible for taking on more, or is there language in the documents that say that call is going to be shared equally among everyone, that nobody is going to be, burdened with extra responsibilities? So that way there's a nice team environment there. So that's something that, as you're thinking about, down the road, when you get to that stage, to have that be a part of the relationship.
Yeah. And Justin, is call schedule often negotiable with like a new contract?
It is. It's very negotiable, and it kind of depends on if you're coming in to provide relief for the practice, or if you're coming in as a partnership track where everyone's kind of going to be on the same page, where they're all rowing equally in the boat, or if you're coming in to kind of provide shift work or what that might be. So in a more of a partnership group practice setting, it's not going to be as common as far as being negotiable. So that's why you really want to be careful that you're not, the one that's going to be taking on the bulk of the responsibility, especially at times when, there's coveted calendar space for vacations and holidays and things like that.
Yeah, good points to consider. Okay, here's some other thoughts. So on the left side of the screen, you see a nice rural country clinic. In fact, that's actually the clinic I work at. It's actually an old house. It's a historic building, just a couple of rooms in there. So you can be a good old country, old-fashioned family medicine doctor like me in a nice little quiet clinic. Or, I mean, does that sound appealing to you? Or maybe like a busy, bustling, metropolitan, major medical center, filled with every specialty under the sun, every service you could possibly need. This is a good idea to find out, what you're comfortable with. And, whether you're early on in your medical school education, like make sure you get exposure to both of these. I mean, maybe not as rural as me up in the mountains, but try to get an experience in the community, private practice, community practice versus, most medical schools will have you working at these big hospitals. And for some, that'll feel like, well, that's just what medicine is. Make sure you kind of get an idea of what you like. And that comes into specialty too, whether it's, family medicine that's choosing rural versus, large hospital, or, you're a surgeon that wants to go work in, somewhere that's kind of a little bit further out there versus attached to a large center. So these can come with different salaries too and different compensation. Is that right?
Absolutely. I was going to ask you, what was your experience? Did you have a chance to shadow early on and get a feel for both of these types of environments as you were looking at your future, or did you not have a chance to do that?
Yeah, maybe not quite as rural as where I ended up, although it was kind of like a passion for me, is that I always kind of had in my mind being this old-fashioned doctor, but I didn't think I'd actually find myself there. So I didn't get that kind of experience, but luckily, I went to UC Irvine for medical school, and we did get, major metropolitan center in the middle of Orange County. This is like, high class, everything is there. And then I did do some rotations in some smaller places where I got to see like a little group of family physicians acting more as a, kind of like a small community. So you do have to fight for this stuff. And it is good to get broad exposure because you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah, and back to your question about compensation, usually in a smaller, more rural setting, it's harder to recruit and attract people to those areas unless they have a family element or roots in that location. Whereas you've got these major cities that there tends to be more demand and more supply of physicians in those locations. And so generally speaking, you're going to expect higher compensation in a rural, more remote location than you would in a kind of a bustling city type of environment.
Yeah, that may be backwards to what some people think of as usually in terms of other careers. Cities attract higher paying jobs.
Mm-hmm.
People kind of flee to the city for, more lucrative adventures rather than, in medicine. Yeah, I mean, when there's not a lot of doctors coming in, you can actually expect maybe the opposite. I don't know if that's applicable to every specialty, but certainly is true in primary care.
It's applicable in most specialties, and part of that breaks down how the reimbursements work. You think about all the different entities that will reimburse you for caring for your patients. The reimbursement structure actually pays out higher levels to the more rural, more remote locations and less to the larger places. And so some of that's kind of out of your control, and it can be to your benefit, but then at the same time, the high cost of living in some of these bigger cities with a lower compensation, it can create a little bit of a challenge where you may need to do other things to supplement the income, or maybe you have a spouse that works as well that can help kind of carry the load of the higher cost of living.
Yeah, that's an interesting balance to strike too, is you have to know how much your money is getting you. Is that even if that pay is a little bit higher in a city center, shoot, if you're going to work in New York City, the cost of living is going to be pretty dramatic. Maybe a little bit of a sticker shock for some people. Cool. Okay, so that was just some broad topics just to get you guys thinking in terms of, what kind of setting do you want to be in? What kind of practice location do you want to be in? Do you prefer call or not? Just some ideas to kind of get you thinking here. So let's talk a little bit about competition. And forewarning, I'm going to go over a lot of numbers here. Don't worry too much about the numbers. I just want to give you an idea of how things play out, but it can be a little busy here. So this is a slide to talk to you about fill ratios, and this is published by the NRMP, which is the matching service every year. And I want to draw your attention to the third column here, which is the number of all applicants per position. It's the fill ratio. So this ratio tells you how many applicants are there per spot? So the higher the number, that means there's more applicants than there are positions. So let's take a look at dermatology as an example here. That's third from the top, and the fill ratio there is 1.38. That's a relatively large number, meaning there's a larger pool of applicants for the positions there. So just based on numbers and people applying, it's more competitive just in terms of who's out there. Not to mention the other things, and we'll go over some of that too. Now let's compare that to pediatrics, third from the bottom, where the fill ratio is closer to 1. It's still above 1, meaning there still are more applicants per spot, but it's a lot closer. So that just means there's less people competing for those spots in pediatrics versus dermatology. It's a really important number to consider whether you're competitive or not, just to know how many people are actually looking for the same spots that you are. So I'm gonna push forward here and we're gonna talk about some other stuff. Justin, any comments on the fill ratios though?
Yeah, I was just going to ask a kind of a stupid question, which is, man, there's only one specialty that has less people applying for it than actual spots. What happens to all the people that don't get into their positions? I mean,
Yeah,
it's
that's a tough topic.
right?
So yeah, I mean, look at something like child neurology, which is very specialized. And now there's caveats to this too, is just because child neuro doesn't have a high fill ratio doesn't mean it's not competitive. It's competitive in different ways. But yeah, I mean, take a look at this, is that across the board, aside from child neurology, there's more applicants for every spot, which means some people don't match. And we'll get into some of the other topics about how to actually, beat those odds, and those will be in the next couple slides. But yeah, it is important to recognize that, yeah, some people don't match, and there's a lot of factors that go into that. If you don't match, shoot, that's a whole nother webinar about what to do if you don't actually get into, a residency slot. But yeah, it's a good point to bring up, is these numbers are getting more competitive every year for sure. So based on those fill ratios, that just tells you how many people are looking at that. So then how do you set yourself apart from all those other people? So that's going to be some of these other slides that we're going to hit. So quick caveat before we dive into USMLE Step 1, because the USMLE recently announced this year that Step 1's going from a scored exam to pass-fail. Let's not get too tripped up on that right now, is that that's going to take place in a couple of years, but for now, people are still looking at the Step 1 score. We'll talk about the implications, in just a moment, but let's go back to dermatology and pediatrics just to get an idea. I know the numbers are boring, but just to get an idea of what the step scores are here. So dermatology, third from the left over there, look at the average match, which is the dark blue number. It's hanging out around an average of 250 on Step 1. That's a pretty darn high score. So whether you're an applicant looking to apply this cycle or maybe next cycle, you have to understand what kind of score you need to get on these exams in order to compete and set yourself apart from the hundreds, if not thousands, of other people applying to this specialty. Compare over there to pediatrics, a little further to the right, 6 from the left, and look at that blue line there. It's a little bit broader too, which tells you there's a little bit more flexibility here, but the average is a little bit less than 230. So those exams that you take, USMLE Step 1, Step 2, and then further on, or if you're a DO, and we'll get to that in just a second, COMLEX exams, these exams carry great weight in terms of your ability to match. So you need to be thinking realistically about what you've got and are you eligible for these specialties. Okay, just a brief mention of some other things. There's actually more to your application than just scores. There's other extracurricular activities, including volunteering, but also things like publications and research initiatives. So dermatology, again, third from the left over there. Look at that big, tall blue peak there. So shoot, man, these people have somewhere in between 12 and 16 different publications and posters. These applicants are heavily involved in research. So if you don't have research, then you're going to need to get it to apply to some of these, competitive specialties, derm, neurosurgery, plastics, and things like that. Look at pediatrics over there. It's hanging down pretty low as the average that match had about 4 publications. Another important, thing to take away from this slide is that look at the difference between the people that matched and didn't match. So the dark blue versus the light blue. there's a pretty big discrepancy between dermatology, meaning the people with research got in, the people with less didn't, compared to pediatrics where those bars are pretty darn close together. Whether you have it or not didn't make too much of a difference in terms of matching, but you did need some. So don't want to get too much caught up into this, but just know things like research count very much depending on what specialty you're looking at. This one's a little bit heavy, but I just want to leave you with the overall thing. This is for US allopathic seniors, so MDs in the US. Look at across the board that then the match rate is pretty darn high, which should be reassuring in the sense that, whether you're going into dermatology or pediatrics, your chances of matching are pretty good considering there's other people applying to these spots that aren't US MDs, US DOs, US IMGs, which is basically US citizens that attended medical school outside the country, and international medical graduates that come from non-citizenship status and educated outside the US. So just being at a USMD school is an important competitive advantage here. Okay, moving on to DOs, I want to give a shout out to you guys out there. These stats are changing every year and more favorable. Across the board, those numbers are pretty similar at the top, right? Around 90% match rate, which is good. But there's a big discrepancy when it comes to competitive fields like dermatology, interventional radiology, orthopedics, is that in something like derm, look at your match rate is only about 38%. There's a big discrepancy there, so just take that into account as you apply, compared to something like pediatrics here in the primary care realm, where DOs tend to do real well. And then last chart, I hope, is a shout out to any IMGs that are listening in. Look at how the whole ceiling of this graph just drops off here. Is that this is tough for international medical graduates to get a match spot in the US. Overall, don't fare too well. The average is about 50%. Those numbers can drop off dramatically depending on what specialty. So derm is sitting at about 44%. But look that more people don't match here than do match for almost every specialty. So if you are an international medical graduate, your chances of matching aren't good to begin with. You're going to have to take a lot of time to improve your application in other domains like research, scores, extracurriculars, leadership, stuff like that. So yes, okay, so I promised that was the end of these terrible numbers. I want you to just kind of leave that with a general understanding of determining, which specialty you're targeting comes with some pretty heavy costs in terms of the amount of effort and things you have to put in to get there. Okay, let's get into something that's a little bit more easy to digest, which is thinking about the length of training that goes into the specialty that you choose. So this has tremendous implications in terms of life, but Justin, I definitely want to get your take in terms of finances here, is that the amount of time you spend in residency could be as simple as time spent training, but it also has to do with money too, because at this point you're probably in debt from undergraduate, maybe a master's degree or more. You're in debt from medical school. You're not going to be making a ton of money in residency, and so the time spent in there tends to compound those effects. But just take a look at this chart here, find the specialty that you might be thinking about, and look at the length of training here. Family medicine doctors like me typically spend 3. There are some 4-year programs there. ER docs about 3 to 4 years, and then all the way to the bottom to neurosurgeons that spend 7 years in residency just to get to the point of actually being an attending physician and drawing a true doctor's salary at this point. So I've been speaking way too much and way too fast. Justin, talk to me about the implications of the length of time spent during your training and how that affects the money that you make, the money that you can save, and maybe if you could even compare to a more traditional career pathway where you exit college and go right into the workforce. And sorry, that was about 20 different questions.
I think you were trying to give me something to really answer there. You weren't sure if I could answer all of those, but maybe one of them, right?
Sure.
So there was a graph that we came across probably, 8 years ago. I'll have to dig that up with our team to bring into maybe one of our presentations in the future. It shows like the position, the financial position of a high school graduate, then goes into undergrad and then medical school and then residency, kind of being, then slowly building back out from a debt perspective, like a net worth perspective. And if you look at each of these, the ones that have a 3-year track, they do have a little bit of an advantage because they get to work sooner. And then the trade-off is the income might be less, and usually is less than some of the other ones. Now, it obviously depends on what else is going on in that person's life, but you do get a chance to get ahead. But at the same time, the longer the training that you have, the more you have to defer those loans, the more the interest is potentially stacking up. And some loans, the interest is not accruing, and some it is during the deferment or the forbearance or the different things you can do to have those loans be on hold until you actually start working. In some cases, you may want to go into a refinancing type of situation, but then that usually requires repayment. The good news is that there's a bunch of different repayment options. We actually were working on an article this morning about every possible way that you can get financial relief, which we could also maybe incorporate in the future segment as far as all the different ways that you can get help, whether that's straight up forgiveness completely after a certain period of time, or getting anywhere from $40,000 to $120,000 over the course of 4 years of forgiveness. But the longer that you're having to wait, the more that your net worth position, meaning you have your assets and your liabilities most likely are going to be exceeding your assets for a good while. And just know that that's normal. And you shouldn't feel like you've made a mistake or that you did the wrong thing. And there are some people out there who will talk to you about how debt is toxic and that you should almost feel guilty about it. But the reality is that it's an investment into your future that will return. There's things that you can do to protect that. And so the longer the duration, the longer it's going to take for you to recover. And so you're going to want to be as frugal as you can be, as strategic as you can be. And then when you get out on the other end of this, being strategic with playing catch up, because there's going to be a lot of catch up time to make. And you want to make sure that the decisions you make during those first few years really get behind you and create momentum rather than slow you down. And it's tough because most contracts that are signed after you finish don't last. The turnover rate's pretty high, and having to start over with building a patient base can slow things down. And so you really want to be careful about those first few years to give yourself the right type of momentum.
Yeah, this is really cool to talk about, and I think is that it's pretty easy for medical students, pre-medical students, residents, even attending physicians like me. Like, you start talking about interest and deferrals and loans, like I kind of get this like a sense to almost like tune it out, right? Is that because it's complicated and you don't really have a good foundational knowledge here. I mean, ask any like a second year pre-med, they could tell you everything there is to know about like myasthenia gravis, like this very rare disease, right? But ask them to tell you about like, hey, what does forbearance on your loans or a deferment on your loans during residency have an implication on your net worth as an attending? And like, shoot. So I think it's a good idea to talk about this stuff, research it, reach out to people, and start getting, building some foundational knowledge here, because if you don't know what you're getting yourself into, then you don't really have any way to protect yourself.
I mean, this is one of the things that we love about medicine, is that it attracts amazing people. And these amazing people that want to get into it are not usually financially driven. It's really for the difference that they're going to make in the community. And yet at the same time, they're such givers. They give because they're sacrificial in nature, but sometimes they give to a fault. And you've really got to start to shift from being, I just want to save the world and help everybody, to actually, I'm going to be able to offer more value to my coworkers, my patients, and my community if I am healthy. And I loved how you started with the work-life balance, because if things are out of whack and not in balance, you're not going to be able to bring as much to the table. And if your cup is essentially constantly empty, you're not going to have much to give, versus if you have a cup that's overflowing and there's abundance there, then you'll have more to provide. And so the loans and the debt and all that, I mean, there's some people out there that say you should pay off all of your debt first before you start saving for your future. And we're not going to get into the details of that. We did that in a different segment. But you'll find that your net worth position can take a royal hit in the long term if you approach it in that way. And so we just want to be really strategic about those things. And so don't be deterred by a longer residency. If you're interested in one of these, it's more about building a plan. You can make any of these work with the right plan. And I don't know, David, if you were going to get into this at all or not, but if you look at this is residency. There's also fellowship, and the fellowship can take,
Yep.
it could be, 1 to 2 to 4 years, potentially more of sub-specialized training on top of that, which can defer things even more. So there's a lot of planning that needs to go into this. And as long as you do the planning and you are intentional about it, it will be worthwhile, and you can turn things around pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think it's important to talk about, learn about. I think that's a good, segue into the next thing, because we kind of touched on, how much you're going to make. Is just throw this chart up here to take a look at, the breakdown of what these different specialties make. And especially, I think, you hit the nail on the head real well, is that I think when I said at the beginning too, like it feels taboo to talk about, money and medicine,
Yeah.
is for this, the reason you said is that just about none of us go into this to make money, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't be, prioritizing that in terms of, goals that you have for your family. Is that you didn't go in this to make money, but it's also would, behoove you not to leave anything on the table, so to speak. So, take a look here about maybe the specialties you might be thinking about. And maybe, and you might disagree when I say this, but in many respects, your parents may have told you before, or maybe friends have told you, like, making a life decision solely based on money can often lead to bad circumstances, right? And so I would never advise a pre-med or a medical student to be like, look at this chart and find the one that makes the most money, and that's the specialty for you, right?
Mm-hmm.
But be aware of what you're getting yourself into, right? So way down at the bottom, sorry pediatrics, I keep picking on you today, but you guys are all the way down there at the bottom. But family medicine, I'm just a little bit higher up there. Primary care is at the bottom of the totem pole here for salary, and yet we also get out of residency a lot sooner, and so there's some differences in terms of, well, you're making less, but you're out there doing it sooner, compared to something like orthopedics, which takes 5 years to get through, 6 years in some cases. Further, if you fellow in certain things, especially like orthopedists like to fellow in specific joints and regions of the body too. So yeah, I mean, it's good to at least be aware of this chart. The numbers change throughout time, although the order doesn't really shift top to bottom, maybe shuffling between a couple here, but just good information to be aware of, I think.
Yeah, and this is a snapshot in time, right? This is looking at usually the last 12 months of data that have been gathered among a number of different sources. And we're looking at the median, the kind of the middle income number. So, with plastic surgery, the 25th percentile might be more like in the 300 range. And then the 75th percentile might be in the 650 range. And then there's all the way out to the 90th percentile. And this chart's looking at what your salary is plus bonuses. So that way it's looking at what your total income is from a productivity perspective, because it's usually you start out with, let's say, a salary where you have a fixed amount of income and you can't really make more, you can't make less unless there's some bonuses. Once you get in and have established yourself, then it tends to transition into an eat what you kill model, meaning it's more along the lines of whatever you produce impacts what you're going to be making personally. And so if you're in academics, these numbers could be dropped down as low as maybe half of some of these numbers. Usually with the primary care specialties, it doesn't go down that much. But when looking at the higher specialties, they can go down to almost a half or 50%, like maybe a 20% reduction in those. And then this is just one aspect. This doesn't take into account if you're doing additional consulting, or if you're doing expert witness, or if you're doing teaching, or if you have some other side gigs, or maybe you are an entrepreneur and you have some business ideas and you have some inventions. I mean, there's so many different applications of this. This is just one sliver segment of this. And this is, don't assume that because you go into ophthalmology that the number is just going to be straight out 357, because that's not the case. Like, this is is also dependent upon how many people are participating in sharing of the data. And I'll tell you that there's an inherent problem with these databases is that a lot of times these organizations, these healthcare systems are the ones supplying the data. And guess what that means? You have a lot of physicians who are not reporting. And therefore, you're not getting a true full sample size of what's out there. So we've negotiated so many contracts, all 50 states, all specialties, that we know contracts better than anyone else. And the data that we have from contracts that we've negotiated, plus all the databases, there's a lot you can do. And usually the offer that you're given from the outset isn't going to be the end result offer that will be provided to you. The larger the institution, the more government-based the institution is, the less negotiable it will be. The smaller, the more independent the practice is, the more negotiable it usually is. There's a spectrum of flexibility there. But again, it's going to be where you need to look out for yourself. You can't get into this stage of things and just assume that they're going to look out for your best interest. They're just not. Medicine's not what it used to be. And the good news is that if you come in as a professional and respectful and you have confidence, that will go a long way when you're armed with the right information to give yourself more fair of a shake than just signing blindly on the dotted line, which happens way too often. And you should never sign blindly on documents that potentially by asking a question, you can make 10 grand just like that because you were inquiring about, hey, there's been some other opportunities that I've seen that have been in this range and you're providing this. Is there any way you could consider getting more in line with this? So that way it's on par, because I really like what you bring to the table and what the opportunity looks like with you. I'd rather be with you, but this is a little bit of a variance here. Is that something you can work with me on? And most of the time they're willing to do something with that. So there's just a lot of opportunity there to come in and help you. And you talk about rebuilding from digging down into debt and then having to slowly build back up. Anything you can do to accelerate this in your favor is going to be advantageous.
Sure. Yeah. It's an active process. It's not going to happen on its own necessarily unless you're actually making moves. So yeah, great discussion. So this is where my slides end and some information of yours jumps in. So just let me know when you want to jump ahead here, but I'll kind of pass it to you here.
Yeah, I'll just start off by saying that think about when you sign a contract. A lot of times you'll get a signing bonus that will be paid out within 30 days of when you start. You'll see that this first column here, the 70%, as far as what percentage of contracts are signed are getting those. So it's actually pretty common. It's more common than that. And you'll see a lot of employers will start off by the contract won't have a signing bonus in it. And guess what? Physicians are signing those contracts and not saying a thing, and they're not getting one. When 70% are getting one and could be getting them. And so it really can come in handy. RVU-based bonuses, that's essentially a function of how much production you've done, how much you've been doing from volume. Quality-based incentives, those are going to be the kind of thing where you really want to get clarity around what's going to be involved there, because there's a lot of times where the bonus might be so ambiguous and sound really good, but you don't know for sure if it's likely for you to get it. And so if you're the first to establish a practice under the umbrella of some sort of a compensation package, you want to find out really the nuts and bolts and the tracking and the metrics. This is where every month you want to be seeing data, the numbers, exactly what you've performed, what you've produced, what you've totaled up, to see if you're on track or off track. Because there are some times where you'll go into an income guarantee type of contract, which I was thinking about mentioning on a previous slide, but then I forgot. You may have a guarantee for a period of time, but that guarantee is only contingent upon you producing enough revenue to have the money to pay and to have that guarantee locked in. And if the revenue is down, guess what? You owe money back and have to pay that money back to the employer. And so some of these quality-based incentives, or like the bonus based on net collections, that's really driven around the metrics that you're creating and generating. And so it's also helpful to see if there's others that are in the practice. When did they bonus? How long did it take them? How many patients did they have to see? What was their schedule like? Did they have the resources and support to get a full schedule early on, or did they have to go out and generate a whole referral network from scratch? And what kind of marketing support is there for you? So those are going to be some key things. You got bonuses based on patient encounters. And so it kind of gives you an idea of there's a range, there's a whole bunch, and every contract is going to be unique. There's all different types that are out there.
Yeah, sounds like if you don't know, you can't ask. So just becoming familiar.
Yeah. So this gives you a sense of the different models of where the revenue is coming from. And so you can see the largest area has to do with reimbursement from insurance companies. And then you'll see kind of this new era of medicine that's been getting more traction. Still very small, the concierge side. But you'll notice you have less control the farther left you go, and more control the farther right that you go. So depending on you and your personality. And I was also thinking about how so much in education and academics is focused on you knowing and learning information about everything else. So the ratio of learning about information to do your profession and to do your work is here. How much time do you spend getting to know you and what makes you tick? What are your values? What's your core? What's your ethos? What are all the things about you? And making sure that you get to know yourself better and what fills you, what gives you energy, and then how does that relate to all this professional here, so that way you can have a better blend. Because the type of practice that you do, there might be a better model here for you based on your personality, based on your values, that fits well, that drives you, that gets you into the mode where you're so motivated that you don't burn out, that you have more energy as a result of that. And I think that might be something, David, that you could comment on based on your experience. What would you say about that in terms of kind of how you've processed and thought about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're hitting on a lot of good topics here too, is that, and that's, I think, the value of this webinar is that this just isn't stuff you think about or know about, and it's kind of just putting it out there to identify gaps in learning. And you're right too with things like, I think life in general is expectation management, right? And so the more you know about what you're getting yourself into, then the more then you that gap between your expectations and reality is your level of happiness or satisfaction. And the larger that gap, it probably at least provides room for things like burnout. And so you want to try to narrow that gap by either setting more realistic expectations, by learning about things like this, so adjusting expectations, and then accumulating the tools and resources necessary to make that reality what you want it to be too. And so you can kind of close that gap. And I mean, in terms of just life in general, medicine in general, is that, I mean, you went into this to do it for the long run. And so if it's things that are kind of, nagging or chipping away at your ability to do that, whether it's debt or finances or the stress of those things, it can chip away and make a big dent in your satisfaction in many different regards.
Yeah, as much as you can delegate the things off your plate that you don't love, the things that don't give you energy, the things that you don't feel like you're thriving in, that you can delegate to people that you trust, the more bandwidth that's going to provide, the more scalable you are as a person to do the things that you enjoy. And so clearly this is something that you have a passion for, which is why you're even tuned into this and you're full speed ahead with it. And so you want to make sure that you have everything at your disposal to equip you to launch into this with the least amount of baggage, the least amount of extra weight on you that would essentially slow you down. So this may not be that relevant to you right this moment because there's some time ahead of you, but as you get closer and closer, you want to look at the culture dynamic of all these models and see, does that really align with you and your culture? Because if it doesn't, you may feel like a little bit of a round peg fitting into a square hole. And so the sooner that you can identify that, the better.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so this is a fun slide because it's looking at I don't know if we can move can we move our, that should be mine. Yeah, okay. The fairness of whether or not each specialty feels like they're getting compensated according to what they should be. And when you're tracking month by month your production or your patient visits, and how does that compare with the rest of the physicians that are in the practice, or maybe even your peers, the volume is really key. And so are you doing more volume or less volume than the median? If you're doing more volume than the median but only getting paid the median, that's a problem. And that's why you'll see, the satisfaction rate, I mean, these numbers are, depending on how you look at it, it kind of can be a double-edged sword, but there's room for growth on this. And a lot of that has to do with being in command and driving the opportunity for yourself and negotiating well and staying in front of it. We have physicians that will check in with us every single year for an audit or for a benchmarking assessment of where are the numbers? Are my numbers still where they should be? That's why I talked about at the beginning. We're all about making sure that you know exactly what you should be making relative to the volume of what you're doing. And some of this is kind of subjective because people are giving their opinions on compensation, but they may not have a good frame of reference around what their volume is relative to others. So this is where if you plug into a team like ours and we can provide you all the data and the analysis, you'll see if it's on par or it's not. And I'll tell you, there's a lot of amazing opportunities. That last chart that had like the breakdown of the compensation from highest paid down to lowest paid, those numbers are not reflective of all the opportunities that are out there. There are others that are even better than that, but it just depends on what type of lifestyle and flexibility or lack thereof you're willing to have. And so this is a challenge. The numbers were higher in years back. Like if you go back 2 decades, the percentages were better. And this is where we get, it kind of makes our blood boil a little bit because the primary driver of medicine is you as you launch into this, and the voice behind the whole industry should be driven by you and not driven by these big institutions. And so there's a lot at stake here. And with them expecting more and more of you and providing less and less, there's a real kind of a challenge here where we have to be cognizant of the negotiation aspect of this and make sure that you are respecting yourself, that you are looking out for yourself, and that you do give yourself the best chance. And so what is your take on this, David, as you look at this? What was your immediate reaction when you saw the numbers for the first time?
I think what strikes me is that there's 2 ways to look at it. Kind of, is you could say like the grass is always greener, right? I mean, you can look and be like, as a cardiologist, your number is relatively low compared to a emergency medicine doctor, which in some ways actually surprises me. But again, I mean, these aren't hard and fast numbers. Just because you're a cardiologist doesn't mean you'd be less satisfied than an ER doctor. But you could always look over like, darn it, I should have been an ER doctor. I would have been happier. I think a better way of looking at it is that, yeah, there's room for improvement, right? Is that across the board, there is imperfect satisfaction in your job. So find ways to improve that satisfaction, whether it's something like you said, kind of delegate off the stuff that is dragging you down so that you can focus in, whether that's actually getting somebody to help you with finances, or whether it's asking your employer for a scribe so you can get away from maybe the documentation that's dragging you down. Do whatever it is. I mean, search and hunt and find those ways to actually make yourself the exception to the rule.
I mean, the good news is that we live in a place where it's a situation where effort counts twice. There's a book called Grit, and you might have seen it. Angela Duckworth, she wrote an amazing book on what grit is and the analysis that they talked about in there, and how effort counts twice. It's really the most important thing, and effort in this area in terms of looking out for your best interest is going to be key. And if you don't like something, you can change it. You're not stuck. And that first offer that you get, those first contracts that you get, don't feel pressure that you have to take it because you got it and you've been waiting for so long. There are so many opportunities out there. There are some places that are more competitive than others, but don't feel like you have to say yes to things if it maybe isn't really where your heart's at. And so you do have options, and if you don't like something or there's an issue, you can change it. And if you feel stuck, that's where mentors and advisors and coaches and there's all kinds of resources out there. It's just a matter of tapping into them.
For sure. Well, we're getting towards the top of the hour. I want to see if we can round this out pretty quickly, but here's another slide for you guys as well.
Yeah. So based on kind of the things we've been talking about, we want to make sure that that first bullet that there is a match for the volume. If the compensation is more than the workload, that's obviously a winning situation, but part of the percentages of being concerned about is the compensation is being less than the workload. And getting a reference from your first round or two of positions and how that translates into the new places that you might go is really going to give you good insight into, is it going to be a better place for you, or is it going to maybe be worse, and you might want to avoid those. These last couple bullets about negotiation, we talked about how most contracts are negotiable. Some are not as negotiable as others. But the last thing that will ever, the worst thing that usually will ever happen to you is that the employer will say no, especially if you do it in a tactful, respectful manner. And so from a negotiation technique, one thing I would share with you is, as you're interviewing and going through and talking with employers, try to just go into it with an open mind and an information gathering. Don't go in providing ultimatums. Don't share with them what your bottom line number is. You want to be careful about setting expectations if they do put you on the spot, because some places will say, hey, what would it take to get you to come on board here? And then now you feel pressure to give them an answer. And you might want to be ready going into it to have a range of what the numbers might be. So that way it's potentially better than where they would start out at. So it gives you some room to negotiate. So also be careful about letters of intent and offer letters. There's now a thing that it's become common practice where they're having you sign off on a letter and agreeing to certain terms and conditions before you get the full contract. And what we'd like to do is actually not have you sign that, or not commit to all that, or do something to kind of table or put on ice that particular document and say, well, let's go into the full agreement, the full document, and see if all of that is in alignment with expectations before we address some of these. And so there's some dynamics there you want to be careful about, because you don't want to take your negotiating chips off the table before it's too late.
Absolutely. Well, good. I think here we're at the end, so I'm glad we were able to kind of wrap this up at the end of the hour too. So Justin, thanks so much for joining us too. I think this is a pretty unique and kind of cool opportunity to talk about things that a lot of pre-meds, medical students, residents, anybody listening in just doesn't get a lot of access to. So thanks for kind of opening the door to have more of these conversations. We could probably talk forever about compensation and satisfaction. I think it's good. We should continue some of these conversations, but yeah, we'll open it up to questions and kind of go from there. Thank you to everybody that joined with us.
Sounds good.
All right. And we'll end it there.
Okay.
Hi, welcome everybody. I hope you enjoyed the webinar. Thank you for putting out all the questions. We'll kind of open it up to some questions right now. Maybe I'll kind of answer some of the ones that have been going back and forth too, but feel free to keep them coming through the chat function, through the question function, and we'll answer them as we go. I'm looking at one right now. I was going to type out the response, but I think it's good for everybody to listen in on. Is someone asked if there are any financial benefits of doing a dual residency, or other benefits of doing a dual residency. And for everybody out there, dual residency would be like internal medicine psychiatry or family medicine psychiatry. There's some pediatrics ones too, but that's a very nuanced discussion. I would probably defer to talking to somebody in the field too, but my impression of these is that these can be cool because you get to learn a lot and you get training in a lot of stuff, but then it's very difficult to find a job where you're going to do both. For most places, clinics, hospitals, they want a family medicine doctor to do family medicine, and they want a psychiatrist to do psychiatry. And so it can be difficult to find it's not like you can work both jobs at the same time and collect two salaries. It's a much more nuanced discussion that I would say, if you're trying to get more money out of it, or more work out of it, that may be challenging, but I would definitely advise talking to an attending that's been down that road.
Dr. Flick, I don't have access to the questions for some reason anymore based on my view. So if you have any there that you see that I could chime in on that we haven't answered yet.
Yeah, no worries. I want to shoot one to you right now. Is that somebody was asking, Nicole Diaz had asked about, when you're talking about contract negotiations, she was talking, is this for residents or post-residency? Most of this, I think, is geared towards after residency, but question for you, can a resident negotiate their salary? Have you done that?
So that's fun, because we've had a number of residents ask us for help with that. And It's pretty much boilerplate. You might find, we've seen a few fellowships where the fellowship is very small, it's very customized, it's not necessarily with an accredited institution. And because of that, there was some wiggle room on some duties or some expectations and some financial things. And it's the kind of case where the fellowship might have one person joining in a private practice setting. And so there's a little bit of negotiation there, but that's about it. The one thing that you might be able to do is get the permission to do moonlighting or other work outside of your regular schedule. And that's not necessarily negotiating the compensation for what they're providing to you as a PGY 1, 2, 3, or whatever. But it gives you at least the freedom to pursue other avenues to earn some more income.
Yeah, and I think it's useful to know too for whoever's out there listening as well as who asked the question is that when you accept the match after match day and you accept that residency position, the AAMC considers that a binding contract. Is once you click the button, you are obligated to go to that residency, and if you don't, there's huge ramifications, including being banned from the match and kicked out. So that, is really bad news for like a resident, right? You're kind of screwed. Sorry, is that if you don't like what you got, tough luck. You already clicked the button and you're stuck with it. So that's good. This is why the AAMC says never, ever, ever rank a program that you're not interested in attending, because if the algorithm matches you, you're going there. Yeah. So good information to look up the salary, the benefits, all that stuff ahead of time, because you don't want to find that out late in the game.
Sure.
This one is a good one for you, Justin. David Osga asked, what are frequent things that you might negotiate at an interview?
So normally we don't recommend that you do any negotiation at all during the interview unless they ask the question point blank, and that is, what would it take to get you to join on with them if they're referring to financial things. And the challenge with that is that you don't want to give somebody what your bare minimum kind of expectation is, because they might have been equipped to provide something greater than what your minimum is. And so you usually want to do your research ahead of time, look at compensation databases, and get a feel for, based on the volume of work that you're going to be doing and how complex it is and the duties that you're going to perform, what the range of compensation might be, and then closer to the 75th percentile range, and talk about that as kind of the area that you're looking to try to get into a place where you have the ability to perform and produce and earn in that range. So that way it gives you some ability to drive the conversation around some level that's up here rather than something else below. Because we've had a number of people who have contacted us and have said that that was their experience. They ended up getting what they said that they wanted, and they didn't do their research, and they found out that, man, there was a bunch of other options afterward that they found that would have provided better opportunities. And so during the interview, that should really be a time where you're asking a ton of questions, gathering as much information as you possibly can, and then wait until you get a contract. Once the contract is provided to you, then it's negotiation time. You don't want to necessarily tell them something that you would want that maybe they would not be interested in providing, to then lose your chances on that, because the contract will have over 100 areas in it that you need to understand and be familiar with and potentially negotiate. And that might be financial things. It might be language things. And so having the full picture in mind, you may find that the termination clauses, what's there, could be addressed by negotiating some financial things to deal with the unfavorable non-compete clause, versus if the non-compete clause is super generous, or maybe the employer will cover tail insurance under all circumstances, then you would rather maybe not put so much pressure on the signing bonus, because you wouldn't want to compromise your ability to get that $20,000, $30,000 sting on the back end from having to purchase a tail to take away from what you're doing on the front end. So there's just a lot of dynamics there. So it's information gathering, asking a ton of questions, not committing to or letting them know what you have to have, but giving them a sense that you're interested in pursuing options here, and you're gonna think it over, and that once they're serious and you're serious, it's really during the interview you want to communicate to them when's the next time you're going to connect. Always be talking about the next step, so that way you've got clear lines of communication, and you know when you should be reaching out to them or when they're supposed to reach out to you, so you keep that conversation fresh and moving, so that way eventually you can get that contract in your possession, and that's when you start the negotiation process.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Justin. I got two people asking about what would be an absolute red flag thing to say or ask during a residency interview. I don't want to get too off topic because we're not totally talking about how to, ace a residency interview. Although I will briefly say, since it is residency interview season right now, and you're probably in the midst of it, there's no such thing as a red flag per se. I mean, unless you're admitting to some wrongdoing or something. But I think just in general, some good tips are to be personal, be professional. Don't talk about your resume, talk about yourself. That's why you got invited to the interview. I don't want to go into too many specifics here since that's not the topic of tonight, but I do want to jump to some other questions here too. Is that I got another question here, a good one from Praise, asking insight on residency finances like salaries and ranges. Justin, do you have a good idea of what maybe like the average intern makes?
So that's really going to vary depending on specialty and location, because the numbers are quite broad. I mean, you could see anywhere from a $40,000 on the low side up to maybe a $60,000, $65,000 on the high side. So it's really going to depend on that. We do have some articles about that I can maybe share afterward for those that are interested. But there's a pretty large range, and then usually that income will stair step year by year by $2,000 or $3,000 as you're progressing along in your training.
Yeah, definitely differences between specialty, location, major metropolitan area, a more community-based setting. And then two, I'll give my pitch from the military side too. So I took something called the Health Profession Scholarship Program and I did an active duty residency, and that depends on your location in terms of cost of living. So I was in Hawaii for 3 years, and I don't want to throw a number out specifically, but it's close to 90,000 for an intern. Pretty shocking, right?
Wow.
But a gallon of milk costs like $10. So the cost of living, is factored in there. So yeah, military folk make a lot more than the average civilian too. That's another thing is, to consider as well too there. But yeah, it definitely depends on specialty and location for sure.
There are some calculators you can use that can calculate the cost of living index per state. So that way you can compare this intern year or residency program, like what the compensation is per area, to see how it affects you. And you can look at rent rates and housing and things like that to give you a sense of is it an even playing field between the two, or does maybe one have better that it's providing overall?
Yeah, it's good. It's not to look at the number, because a lot of people apply really broadly. And so maybe if you're looking at Nebraska versus New York, is just don't look at the number face value, consider what that money gets you, right?
Absolutely.
Man, can you imagine? I don't know what rent is like in Manhattan if you're like in Columbia. It's got to be pretty similar to what we were paying out in Hawaii too.
Yeah, it is.
Let's see. So somebody is asking here, Alexi hit him up with some info too, but they're asking, Melissa asked, does the sign-on bonus still apply for the new graduate? And she also mentioned intern physician, or is this more applicable to an attending? We're talking about attending physicians in their first month. And so maybe, Justin, can you talk about, what kind of financial incentives are out there for like the new graduate?
The new graduate meaning going into training for the first time?
Like fresh out of your residency.
Straight out of residency, so you're taking your first position afterward. So there's a whole bunch of them. And one more thing that I would maybe add to the last question is maybe there isn't a signing bonus provided right off the bat, but you can start interviewing with employers, and they may provide you some loan forgiveness or some loan repayment assistance, like a stipend. So that's something that you could consider while you're in training to help you, if you can get out in front of your peers and can start connecting, doing interviews, and maybe get a position locked down sooner. Even 2 years before you start, you can use that as an advantage to get established and start getting additional cash flow to start chunking away at the interest that has accumulated. So that would be kind of an recruitment incentive. But sign-on bonuses, relocation, reimbursements, there can be, starting out. I mean, you're going to have other benefits included that aren't necessarily incentives. Usually, most employers will cover your cost to come out to see them. They'll shoulder that burden for you. Rarely do they not. If they don't, that might be a red flag, but it's pretty typical. If they're serious about you, they would have you come out. The other compensation package items, I mean, you're going to want to know about the vacation time, CME time off, allowances for dues, licenses, and subscriptions, allowances for CME, getting a nice package to help you be able to go someplace to a nice conference and make sure that all the expenses are covered is going to be key, because if they don't pay for it for you, there's a good chance that if you pay for them, if you're a W-2 income earner, you're not going to be able to take a deduction for those expenses. And that's kind of more getting into the weeds around it, but that's also something to take into account.
Plus, you can't go to any cool conferences right now too. All online. Not really exciting.
Yeah.
But probably, and Melissa, thank you too. That feedback is good. Is that I think loan forgiveness is probably a pretty attractive thing to a new graduate coming out with potentially, undergrad loans and medical school loans, and then deferred loans maybe through residency. Is that the implication of having the company give you something to chip away at that debt can be pretty attractive, I think.
One other thing that you may find employers would do is they would provide an incentive for you to cover your first year of financial planning or tax planning, or maybe even giving an allowance for a disability insurance contract, because if you can't work due to an accident or an illness and you've invested so much into your profession and you're expecting to have 30 years of working life to earn income and to save and to pursue your financial goals, if that income stream shuts off, what are you going to do? And some employers will provide some allowance and some kind of almost like a checking account, an other expense fund that you can use to purchase things like a disability insurance contract to make it a little bit easier for you to have your first year have less, newer expenses that you have to take on.
For sure. Jonathan, I see your question out there. I'm not forgetting about you. Not totally in line with our discussion, but I'll hit you up real quick because I don't see any other questions coming up real quick. Jonathan's asking about, hey, if you've been out of medical school for a little bit of time, haven't started residency, what can you do to strengthen your application? That's tough. And, honestly, I work with a lot of applicants every single cycle, this included. There's lots of people out there like you, so don't lose too much hope. Is that there's a lot of people that finish medical school and can't get into a residency, or they're not eligible for it right away, and you're stuck with this amazing MD degree. Do anything with it. Really, really frustrating. And plus you got all like this debt heaped up on you, which can be stressful and frustrating. So there's no one resource out there that has like a link to externships or observerships. You got to go hunt this stuff down on your own, which puts a lot of the onus on you, but is worth the time. So my idea is, wherever you're at, basically start drawing concentric circles around your location, looking for academic centers and reach out to them directly. Tell them your situation. Hey, I graduated from a Caribbean school, or I'm an international medical graduate, moved to the US, need some experience in the US. Hey, can you take me on? It's usually going to be a volunteer thing. Very rarely are you going to get paid as a house physician, although it is possible. I've seen people get like a house physician job at UCLA, but you should go into it with the expectation this is basically like shadowing, get your feet wet, get a little bit more clinical experience, but it's a tough position. One other question coming through. Thank you, Melissa, for all your questions. Asking about, she was saying, well, we were talking about disability contracts. Sorry. saying those are important to know about. Next question was when she said, what does other mean in how physicians accept payment? I think this was out of your slide deck of things like insurance, cash, stuff like that. There was like an other, probably not talking about like the rural physician accepting like bread and eggs, although that has been known to happen at my practice. But yeah, what is that other? What's that other way of getting payments?
I actually started answering that question in the chat, and I was thinking about it was referring to the way that bonus compensation is taken in. I need to go do a little bit more digging on that other category to see what the range of items is on that, because I don't have the breakdown of that from that research report that we pulled. So I'll need to go research that some more.
Yeah, good question, Melissa. We'll get back to you on that for sure.
Yeah.
Although it did make up a small percentage. I think it's worth knowing and good to research about. But I mean, I think on that graph, I mean, most physicians are taking things like, insurance, cash, something like that. But good to know about for sure, especially if you're a little bit more of a entrepreneur and you want to find out different ways of revenue and things like that.
I mean, one example would be where somebody who has a contract with the business and maybe they would trade services with them in exchange. So maybe it's a technology thing or some sort of business arrangement. And they would say that we'll provide care on this basis, and the payment would be an in-kind type of exchange of value where we're not having to pay full price on some other type of a deal. And so that's pretty uncommon, kind of off book sort of thing, but that's maybe an example of something that someone would do.
Yeah, good question. I'm just scrolling back here. We're not getting a ton of more questions, so we may consider wrapping up in a little bit. I'm just kind of scrolling through here to see if there's any stuff that we missed here. See what else is coming through. I don't see any more questions on here. We talked about salaries for residents, talked about dual residency, IMG stuff. See what else we got coming through. So Ann Lee's asking, how difficult is it to get into a residency program in different locations? I think the question here is, how does it vary by location to location? And it varies greatly, even in, something that's relatively not competitive like family medicine. We'll take that, for example. This is where you got to do the research. And I linked you guys up to www.residencyexplorer.org. It's a free tool from the AAMC. And you can basically throw in your board scores, your experience, and then you can sort by location. You can pick a specific state, you can pick a specific geographical area, or you can just look all over, and you'll find that you can see the competitive scores and experiences for every program, well, just about most comprehensive resource out there. And you can look, and you'll find that rural places are going to be not as competitive as places like UCSF versus somewhere that's a little bit more like inland California. You're going to find greatly different competitive situations there. So super important to do your homework. You can't just say, oh, it's family medicine, I'm going to apply wherever I want. You got to do your due diligence up front. So yeah, it varies greatly. We got another question too about how do you know if you're good enough for a specialty? Same stuff on Residency Explorer. You got to go plug in your data. So, some of that stuff I posted from like the NRMP's data, that'll give you like means for things like USMLE Step 1, Step 2, super important. But if you want to look specifically at individual programs, you can access that more granular data on the Residency Explorer app. If you're just thinking specialty, then I would start at the NRMP's website, because you can just look at like peds versus derm, and you can see, hey, look, like it or not, until Step 1 goes to pass fail, and I think one more year, everybody's looking at Step 1, and then in another year or two, it's going to be all on Step 2. So you're going to have to meet those, basic hurdles of the step scores before you consider other things like, publications and stuff like that. Thank you, Alexi, for throwing that link in there to Residency Explorer, free resource. It's the most comprehensive resource out there for evaluating your competitiveness across the board. So definitely use it. Any other questions coming through right now? We'll give you guys a couple more minutes. Thank you guys for the good discussion. I'm glad we could cover tons of this stuff. I think everybody's a little bit stressed out right now. We're in the middle of the residency application cycle. match isn't for a couple more months. People are getting interview invites. I'm really happy that a lot of people are starting to think ahead for next year, because who knows what next cycle is going to look like. It's probably going to be challenging too, just based on the implications of what COVID has done for people's medical education this year. But plan ahead and prepare. Do your homework up front. We got one more question coming through right here. Rebecca, if I do my clinical rotations in one state, can I apply for residency in a different state? Absolutely. So you're not limited to one state based on where you went to medical school, where you did rotations. Now, if that's your number one pick, then you want to do an audition rotation at that facility, whether it's in-state or out-of-state. So, for me, example, so I went to Hawaii for my residency and I lived in California. I made the trip out to Hawaii to do an audition rotation for 4 weeks. Certainly didn't hurt that the Army paid for that for me. But anyways, you got to go out there. You got to do a rotation with them if you want a good shot at matching there. That's especially true of more competitive specialties like surgical specialties and such. But if it's a high-ranking program for you that you plan on ranking 1, 2, 3, you're going to want to rotate there. Even if you didn't, you can absolutely apply there. You have to have interviewed at a program in order to rank it. Otherwise, you're just a name in the bucket. They're not going to know you from anybody else. But yeah, you can apply anywhere. You can only match the places that you actually interview at if you want a good chance at matching them.
For the question back that was asked regarding kind of a range of expectations for salary, there is a medscape.com post. If you just do a search for average medical residency salary, it will provide some data there that you can use to give you a sense in the range.
Can you quote a number off there? 40, 50?
You know what? Yeah, I can. Let me pull it up here. Hang on a second.
50? When I was in residency, which wasn't too terribly long ago, I think my peers in the civilian world were averaging around 40, 50.
Yeah, so for 2019, it was 61. So back to 2015, it was 55. It went to 56, 57, 59, now 61. And then looks like it's kind of the upper end is 67, which must not be talking about the contract that you had in Hawaii. The low side, 57.
Yeah, that's different. But I mean, there's two ways to look at that, right? Is that you could come out of medical school and make like $60,000 and you could say, gosh darn it, I'm a doctor and I'm working 80 hours a week and all I make is 60,000. Or you could be like, for the first time in 4 years, I'm actually making some money. There's two ways to look at it. But yeah, it is good to know about what you make so that you don't get that shock, that punch in the nose when you first show up and get your first paycheck. It's all relative.
Yep.
Melissa is asking too about if we're doing any other webinars on other topics. Alexi, you could probably link Melissa into some of the other webinar database that we got going on, as well as any future webinars coming up too. And then Anne is asking if people have questions, can they reach out to us directly? To get to us at Med School Coach, just cruise to our website, medschoolcoach.com, and you can hit us up through a chat feature, send us an email. You can do free consult calls with myself or any of the other departments that you're interested in working with. Justin, is there a way for people to contact you for questions and things like that?
Yeah, same thing. If you want to send me an email, you can at justin@physiciansthrive.com. I'd plug it into the window down there, but for some reason I can't type into it. Otherwise, our website, physiciansthrive.com. We've got a contact option there. Our phone number's there. So you can contact us anytime. We are very flexible. We have availability after hours as well, if it's more convenient to connect when you are outside of regular work hours. So that's also a possibility.
Okay. And with that, I think we'll wrap it up in just a few minutes. I'll give it another 2 or 3 minutes just to see if any other questions come through. Otherwise, thank you guys so much for joining us. I think it was pretty cool to talk about, one, just to get like an honest look at, hey, whatever specialty you're looking at, be realistic about what you're capable of getting yourself into. And then, yeah, I'm glad we could kind of open the door to this discussion about finances, money, things that, we don't often talk about medical school. Certainly, I mean, 4 years of medical school, like I learned everything there is to know about, I don't know, random chemicals and things like that. Person's second year, which I didn't use, and yet money, which is really important to, managing your future, didn't quite get any education on how to do stuff like that. So I think it's cool that there's people out there like you that are helping, pre-med start learning about that stuff, get financially literate early so you don't make any of those mistakes, learn from the mistakes of others. And yeah, it's awesome.
Getting a head start or trying to get yourself a head start is going to be key. I mean, having to wait 10 years potentially to really start getting things going, the more you can do earlier, the better off you'll be to help kind of start catching up.
For sure. I always get these Medscape surveys that get sent out to attendings, and on every single survey it asks about what was the greatest financial mistake you made. And I haven't made one, but the fact that they're asking means that physicians are making very serious financial mistakes, and people like Medscape are keeping tally of that stuff,
Well, there's also a statistic that says what is the number one concern among all physicians, like the number one financial concern. And I think we talked about this in our last recording that we did, but it's having enough money to retire. You would think that going into medicine would be like the magic wand, that there should be no issues whatsoever financially in the future, but it is the number one concern among all age groups, not just younger physicians, but even older physicians. You would think that by then they would have done enough planning, and it's just life can get busy and things can get away from you, and the amount of money that you save, most of it might be taxable, and taxes play a huge role in how much you're going to be able to withdraw from the various accounts that you use to save. And so that's going to be a key thing to be thinking about, is what your tax strategy is along the way.
For sure. Well, good. Well, thank you again. I think we're going to kick it off at this point. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Justin, thanks for being with us for the webinar. Hit us up on Med School Coach or Physicians Thrive if you got any questions or concerns. Join us for any other webinars that are up in our future too. And with that, I'll say good night.
See ya.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.